All right, and I am going to get started. I know that we'll probably have some other people coming in. Unfortunately, I can't share my screen and see who's coming in and out. So we'll just kind of wing it from here. But welcome everyone to my presentation today. My name is Pete Bailey, and somewhere in the crowd is Janet Ruest, who is just kind of going to, she's also volunteers for our organization, Population Education. So she'll might be answering some things in the chat or just a friendly face looking on to see what I'm doing here. Um, so, as I mentioned, I work for an organization called Population Education. Population Education is a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., and our mission is pretty straightforward. We provide quality training, so through conferences like this, or we work a lot with pre-service teachers, professors at universities, as well as teachers in the classroom. And we provide teaching materials mostly in the form of lesson plans for educators to help them cover population topics effectively in the classroom. Population topics are not always easy to cover. For one, there aren't a lot of organizations that include them in their curriculum. So we try to support that with our supplemental curriculum that you'll all have a chance to take a look at following this workshop. As you can see at the bottom, of course, our name is Population Education. We always have our finger on the pulse of the population. Right now, we're at about 7.8 billion people in the world. And for some context, when our organization started in 1985, the population was just over 4 billion. So here's a typical look at some of our workshops. As you can see, we've got pre-pandemic photos here, as well as during the pandemic photos, or more screenshots, I suppose. And these photos really capture what our lessons are like at Population Education. You'll notice that people are standing up, working in groups. Even when we have online workshops such as this, we still are involving the audience through our digital tools that we created at the beginning of the pandemic to really get people engaged. Most of Population Education, including myself, are former teachers, and we know what works and what doesn't work when we're talking about lesson plans in the classroom. So we really do our best to make our activities as hands-on as possible so that students are not only learning these concepts, but remembering them, or as we like to say, owning the concepts. And I hope that you'll have a little bit of get to see that during the workshop today, because we are including one activity where hopefully we get to use a digital tool. So I mentioned that we, of course, teach about population topics. And you might be thinking, yeah, population might come up once or twice in the curriculum, especially social studies, geography, actually comes up a lot more than other areas. But we like to take a really broad look at population topics and what a population topic is. And that they typically fall into one of two themes, or both at the same time, depending on what you're teaching. Environmental themes such as resource use, agriculture, sustainability, and then societal themes. So anything from huge global trends like urbanization or public health, which is of course very topical right now. But we also talk about smaller issues like what happens to a small community when we see population booms or busts. What does representation look like so that people have a voice in how their country is being run? And so often we focus a lot on women's and girls' education, including human rights. At the end of this workshop, you will all receive access to our online curriculum, Teaching Population. This is a supplemental curriculum that you'll have access to forever. You enter the URL and put in the passcode, and then you'll have access to this as long as you are teaching. It includes 60 hands-on lessons for grades K through 12, plus a bunch of student readings, infographics, charts, maps, tons and tons of resources that I really hope you have the chance to explore following the workshop. All of these lessons are standards aligned, including to all Canadian provinces. So you will be able to, we do have a tool on our website that shows a matching standard for each lesson plan, or however many of those standards match to your curriculum. So that's a very helpful thing. I know as a former teacher, I had to abide by the standards very, very clearly. So this was a big help to me when I was teaching. All right, so I'm ready to be done with that intro and really dive into some of the lesson demonstrations that we have for you today. So I'm going to ask you, as you're sort of watching this or participating in other parts, put yourself in the mindset of your students. So whatever grade you teach, maybe grade 7, grade 9, whatever it may be, think about how your students would view these lessons and participate in these lessons, because they are designed for students. I'm going to take you through 3 different lessons, plus a short video that we're going to start off with, and just sort of see these resources for ourselves, do some of these resources, and really get an idea of our offering so that you'll then be able to take that into your classroom in the future. Of course, I don't think we are able to see your faces on camera, which is totally fine. I will be checking the chat box periodically between lessons, but for the most part, I will keep all questions to the end. So I apologize in advance if you have really a question you need to ask. Please make sure you still type it in the Q&A section, and then I'll leave time to address it at the end. All right, so our first activity today is actually a very short video that visualizes the growth of the world population from the years 1 CE, so stands for Common Era, all the way and projecting it into the year 2050. This is what we call the DOT video, in case you've ever seen a population education workshop before, and is a really great resource to show students, to sort of get them interested in exactly what population growth has looked like over the years. All right. So I think everyone can see that. And I'm going to begin.
An environment is a system of living things. The Earth is our environment. The capacity of our environment to provide space, to produce food, and to supply energy are all limited. Humans thrive on less than 17% of the Earth's surface, and only about 4% will grow crops. We depend on these limited resources for our survival, yet we are increasing our population as if they were infinite. This fact is at the core of our environmental problems. On this map, we'll show population growth from the year 1 CE to the present, and project our growth into the year 2050. Population concentrations will be indicated by dots, each of which will represent 1 million people. In areas where people are spread out and don't live in concentrations of 1 million, dots are placed in the middle of their approximate range. Historical references will be provided by images and text at the bottom of the screen.
All right, so here we are in the year 1 CE, again, stands for Common Era. And this is what for the most part, what we know of the human population on the planet Earth. There are 170 yellow dots on our map to begin with, and that represents the 170 million people who are living on the planet at this time. Now, first thing that our students typically notice is that a lot of these dots are concentrated in really 2 main areas. which is current day India and current day China. The reason for that is because the really fertile riverbanks of these two areas, so when we're talking about geography, of course, people are settling down on these fertile riverbanks. And instead of that sort of hunter-gatherer lifestyle, more people are staying put and creating these large communities of over 1 million people, which is what earns them a yellow dot on our screen. You'll notice that in the Americas, we don't see that many yellow dots. That, of course, does not mean there are not millions of people who are living there, but they're much more spread out. And people are not settling down in communities as early on as they were in the East. So that's why we see fewer yellow dots at this time. As we move through time, you'll see dots appearing with that sort of yellow burst. And it's important to not only see where the dots are, but where they're starting to spread to. And you can use these logos at the bottom, these events, to see how people are moving around the globe. Similar to the dots appearing, you'll also start to notice dots disappearing when people are dying in large quantities. If you take a look over at China right now during the Mongol invasion, between war, famine, and plagues, we're losing a lot of dots. That, of course, spread to Europe, which is what we know of as the Black Death. And at this time, we lost 75 million people, which is 1/5 of the entire world's population. That was the only time through this entire video that population growth was actually negative. So we were losing more people than we were adding. About 20 years later, we were able to repopulate and make up for that. You'll start to notice people moving over to the Americas at this time, both voluntarily through European colonists, and also involuntarily through the Atlantic slave trade. It's important to make that distinction with your students. In about 5 seconds, you'll notice that we hit 1 billion people on the planet. This is right around the time of the Industrial Revolution, and all of the progress through industry, modern medicine, accelerates our pace of growth much faster. We already hit 2 billion only 150 years later. All right. So here is our map. And I'm actually going to ask if you have a comment or something, put it in the chat. Thank you, Sherry, for already using the chat. But I've figured out how to see both the chat and the video at the same time. Very proud of myself for that. So what do you notice, though? What do you think your students are going to really take away after they see this? The heartbeat definitely was something, we added for dramatization, for sure. What is one of the first reactions you have, though, when you see these areas that were sparsely populated and now are solid blocks of yellow? Any thoughts going through your head? Chantel, I love that you bring up feeding the population. That, of course, is one of the most important parts of what we're doing to sustain this large population. And we actually have a lesson that I'm going to touch upon that sort of shows how we are able to do that. But thank you for adding that. One thing that I notice as somebody who studied a lot about climate change is where are people going to go when coastlines, where the majority of people are, start to sea levels start rising, impacting coastlines. All these places, especially in India, sub-Saharan Africa, and also the coasts in the Americas, are really full of these people that will need to go somewhere if we don't get a control on climate change. So that is something that I think about a lot. And I think Carla has a really good point. Can places that are filled with yellow reasonably hold more people? And that's a question for governments and city planners. For example, Lagos, which is right in sub-Saharan Africa, sort of, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but where I'm pointing to now. This is a city that is growing so rapidly, and people are finding creative ways to either build up instead of building out to save space, building larger buildings. Or there was even an instance of building into the ocean on sort of these floating schools, they call them. So that people, of course, get very innovative about sort of space, but it is worth pointing out that there are areas, specifically in the Americas, where we have room for people. America and Canada both have quite a lot more room than our population than other areas around the world. So it's all something to keep in mind when we talk about refugees and we talk about immigration. All right. So this is, of course, a really good way to help students understand the history of population growth and how that pace has quickened in the last 2,000 years. But we also have data to go behind the map, and that is accessible for all teachers. So I'm going to take a look you through that right now. If we click on this little image here, it'll bring us to the same map in year 1 CE. Of course, this map we can manipulate a little bit. Down here, we've got the timeline with a cursor that you're able to move through time manually. And you can see dots appear and disappear as time goes on. On this timeline, we also have all these little white diamonds here. And these diamonds note the different events throughout history, such as, let's see, a good one. The compound microscope, developed in 1590. And if you think about all of these events that we have on these white diamonds, such as the compound microscope, how would this affect population growth? Because all of the events are tied to population growth in some way. How would the compound microscope affect population growth? You can put your thoughts in the chat. Says that it allowed for the study of germs and microorganisms. Yes, absolutely. Glenn and Emily, helps with our health, right? And medical advances. Before that, if we don't really know what's getting people sick, it's a lot harder to stay healthy. So this is, of course, a huge important invention towards lowering the death rate, and which is, of course, a very good thing. So these events are broken up into 5 sub-themes: science and technology, the environment, people and society, health, and food and agriculture. And students can sort of explore in that way. You can also zoom in on the map to get a better view later when all of the events sort of start merging together in the 1800s and post. I could spend all day, an entire workshop on this map, but I do want to get to other things. So the last thing I'll show you is the overlays that we have here. Someone mentioned human land use, or excuse me, food and agriculture. How are we feeding all of these people on the planet? We have an overlay on this map that shows how land use has changed as we've added more and more people. So starting in the year 1700 and moving forward. And you'll see that more and more land is used for feeding people rather than, wild land and preserved land. So I'll play through this overlay. It does happen fast, so make sure your eyes are on the screen. Guess not that fast. So as you can see, things are shifting a lot. The wildlands are changing into croplands at much faster rates, or rangelands really is what we see mostly happening, because people's diets are forming more towards meat than anything else. The other overlays we have are fossil fuel CO2 emissions, fertility rates, urbanization, and life expectancy. I know a lot of people cover urbanization, and of course, anything related to climate will have a history of fossil fuels, so emissions. So please use this. This is a free resource open to anyone, and we do have specific lesson plans that go along with it. So that link is actually on the schedule, and has been posted for anyone's use. So please use it. All right. Going to head back to my PowerPoint now. So here's just a graph of the same population growth that we saw in the video. Of course, we call it the J curve because it's steady for so long, and then that rapid increase starting around the Industrial Revolution in the year 1800. Other ways to look at it, and this is really helpful for math teachers, is to sort of see this in a chart form, or even the doubling time. So you see it took quite a long time to double the population from 500,000 to took 296 years to double the population from 500,000, and that should be in millions or thousands, I believe. But then we see the doubling time decrease and decrease to only 49 years here, where we're projected to hit 8 billion in the year 2023. All right. I'm just going to jump into our first actual demonstration lesson. It's called For the Common Good. And this is a simulation, and we're going to try out a Google tool here for remote learning in case you are still teaching remotely in the fall. In the simulation, students are going to be drawing resources from a common pool and determining consumption strategies to preserve a long-term supply. So here we go. Here's what we are going to do. I am about to put the link to this Google presentation into the chat. I would like everyone who's able to please click on that link, and you'll be brought to this slide. If you go to slide, the rules are on slide 1. If you click on slide 2, you'll see sort of a pool with a bunch of names. Now, I'm going to ask the following people to please enter their name into where it says name. And you'll notice that you are able to delete that and write whatever name it is into these boxes. So I'm going to ask Janet, Penny, Colleen, Crystal, and Sophie to please enter their names into one of their boxes, doesn't matter which one. And I'm going to ask you to play this game. I know you didn't quite volunteer when I was teaching. We used to call this being voluntold. But it would be fantastic if you could help us out. Let's see. Seems like Sophie might not be able to get in, which is totally fine. Glenn, would you mind taking that green box and writing your name in it? Awesome. Wow, this is working great. Okay. So first I'm going to go over the rules, and then we are going to play this game. And this, of course, is a remote version. The real life version is a little more engaging for students because it's physical. But I hope you'll get the point from this game because it does have a good lesson at the end. So here are the rules. Rule number 1: the chips in the blue pool belong to everyone. And feel free to follow along on the rules slide, or you can stay on that slide. So the chips in the blue pool belong to everyone. Rule number 2, you may remove red chips from the pool while the music is playing. When the music stops, you may no longer remove chips. So I'm going to play some music. While you hear that, you can take chips, the red dots are chips, out of the pool and drag them into your square. Rule number 3, you cannot return a chip to the pool once it leaves the circle. So once you take it, it's yours. That's that. You're not putting it back in the pool. Number 4, if you gather 10 red chips, you can trade them in for a yellow star. Now, as adults, that might not seem very exciting, but let's pretend that the yellow star is just something that we really, really want, right? In person, I would say it's either a piece of candy or a sticker or something that students would really love to have. So, you know, that's the incentive. You get 10 chips, you get a yellow star. And lastly, at the end of each round, I will double the number of chips left in the pool up to a maximum of 20 chips, since there are only 5 of us playing. So there's never going to be more chips than what we start with, but I will double it at the end of each round to back to 20 chips, or however many are remaining at the end of each round. I will double that number. There is one other piece. There's no communication from you all during this game. And that is probably the most important rule that we have right now. You should all, you know, of course you can't talk with each other since we're all in different places, which helps during this. But there's going to be no communication from anyone. I will say right now, feel free to ask questions if you have any in the chat, just strictly to me, and you know, no strategy or anything. So does anybody have any questions? All right. And feel free to ask questions at any point, as long as you're not communicating to the other people. So you already have a little red dot in your square, a little red chip. Please take that and drag it back into the pool. That's just to practice with. All right, wow, fantastic. So when you start hearing the music, you may begin taking chips out of the pool. Remember, once you get 10 chips, you get the amazing yellow star. So just wait for the music. All right, so it looks like we've taken some chips. First things first, did anybody get 10 chips? Crystal and Glenn came close. No, not quite. We were close though. So next thing I'll do, of course, at the end of each round, I said I would double the amount of chips in the pool. So let's see. Well, that's difficult. What is double 0? Looks like we used all of the chips, so we have nothing to double left in the pool, which would end the game. So unfortunately, no one got a gold star. Now, your students will start to, you know, I recommend when you're doing this with your students to play this a couple of times. Since we are limited on time, I'm going to ask everyone to please put your chips in the pool. Put them back in the pool. We'll restart entirely. And this time, I'm going to change one rule. You're going to be allowed through the chat to come up with a strategy. So discuss amongst yourselves right now, best you can with the chat feature, what we should be doing so that we're able to make sure we start getting some gold stars. And go ahead, I'll give you 2 minutes. Does anyone have, oh, there you go. I'm not going to say anything now. It's a great thought. Chantel, you cannot steal from each other. Katie, I will say the maximum number of chips in the pool is 20, so they won't continue to double. They only double up to 20 chips. Good thought, though. All right, we've got about 30 seconds, so if we can come up with an agreement on someone's plan. All right, sounds like you all agree that, or starting to agree that one person can take 10 each round. So who's going to be the first one to do that strategy? All right, looks like Glenn is going to be the first one. Let's see how this strategy works out. So once again, when you hear the music, you may begin taking chips. All right. So I think we may have overdone it with the Glenn, with the chips going to Glenn, which can happen in a virtual setting. But I'm going to take these chips from Glenn and exchange them for a star. Let's see. 1 star, and I'm going to take 10 chips. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, shoot. I should actually be bringing them over here. And I think we're left with 3 or 4 still with Glenn. So I'll just leave those where they are because it's not quite enough for another star. And now I'm going to double the amount of chips that are left in the pool. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're going to get 6 more. Now there are 12 in the pool. And we will play this one more time just for the rounds, if we were playing in the classroom, would go on indefinitely until you decided to stop it as the teacher. In fact, for the sake of time, I'm going to pause it there because I think you guys do understand the strategy here, which you absolutely were able to accomplish. And I'm going to answer some of your questions and sort of talk about the debrief. Because, of course, yes, this is a fun game for students to play, and they get really, really into it because it's competitive. But there, of course, is a big lesson behind it. So if we continued on this path to say every 10, once around, one person got a star, the pool would double back to 20. And so on and so on, everyone would be able to get a star. However, Glenn makes a good point. This is all an agreed upon thing that you all are sort of talking about. At any point, Penny could have just started grabbing chips for herself and said, nah, I don't care about our agreement. I want some chips. In which case the entire thing could dissolve. So the idea of an international treaty is exactly where we're going with this. Now, what was the difference between the first and the second rounds that we played? What rule did we take away? undifferentiated resource grab, right? And we couldn't communicate, right? So at the end of the day, the lack of communication, the inability to come up with a strategy and work together was what really set us up for failure. Because if you don't know what your neighbor is going to do, then it is in your best interest to grab as many chips as possible and hold them dearly, which of course, in the end, would mean the resources are all gone. Exactly, Vincent, a tragedy of the commons. Which then poses the question, what do these chips represent in the middle of, in this pool? What do they represent in the real world? Definitely resources, but a specific type of resource. So actually not so much water and air. Agreed that, you know, water and air are we all need to do our part to keep them clean. But Stacy says fish. Fish is probably the best example. They represent resources, but specifically renewable resources, because if we leave enough in the pool, they will repopulate. And then as long as we don't overindulge, as long as we're not overfishing, we can sustain ourselves forever based on these materials, if we are all, you know, respectful of one another. And there are just about a million different examples of this that we see in the real world. So at the end of the day, this is, yes, teaching about tragedy of the commons. It's teaching your students to work together, but it's also teaching about how to manage renewable resources and why it's so important. And the fact of the matter is that we could have a very different planet if we knew how to manage and communicate and work together as a planet. And I know that sounds very kumbaya, but it's the truth. And we see it a lot in communities all over the world. COVID vaccine shots. I think there are definitely ways to draw that connection. You know, if we spread them all out, we will end the pandemic faster. Exactly. Thanks for sharing that, Chantal. I have not heard that before, but that's a very good point. I'm going to save questions for the end, and then we are going to start our next lesson here, which is really hits on the theme of this conference, which is storytelling. So our next activity is called Who Polluted the Potomac? And let me just stop sharing my screen. Great, I think that worked. So this next activity is called Who Polluted the Potomac? Now, the Potomac River, for those of you who are not familiar with a river in America, which I imagine is, it could be anyone. Potomac River is the river that Washington, D.C. was built upon. So this story, while it does focus on the Potomac River and this activity, that is a placeholder. You could absolutely use, instead of the Potomac River, use a and we suggest with your students to use a local river or just any body of water. Any of the Great Lakes would be fantastic to use. Even we have the Pacific Ocean or Atlantic Ocean. Definitely can use that in place of the Potomac River. But for our sake, since our organization is based in Washington, D.C., we like to use the Potomac. Give me 1 minute here as I get set up, because this is a little bit of a setup. All right. So this is a story, plain and simple. And I'm going to read the story. If we were in the classroom, I would hand one of these film canisters to each one of my students. When they heard their character name come up in the story, so when they heard construction sites come up in the story, they would walk up to the front of the classroom where I would have this bowl of water on a desk, and they would dump the contents into the bowl of water. That way, students are engaged and they're listening and they're participating in this activity. So let me get started with our story. This is the story of the Potomac River and the changes to the river that humans made over time. Listen for the name of the character printed on your container. When you hear your character named, come up to the river, open your container, and dump in its contents. For more than 10,000 years, people lived on the banks of this river. During that time, they raised families, hunted in the forests, grew crops, and caught fish. Imagine that the bowl of water in front of you was taken from the Potomac River by a Nacotchtunk about 500 years ago. And in the chat, can anyone answer me, how does this water look to you? Does it look clean? Would you eat fish out of it? Yeah, it does look refreshing. I agree. So definitely we got a bowl of clean water here. The Nacotchtunk built small seasonal villages and a fur trading town on the banks of the Potomac. They cut down trees and used the lumber and bark to build buildings. They cleared sections of wetland and planted crops of corn, beans, squash, and potatoes. They quarried rock to create tools like axes and arrowheads. They fished from the river during the seasonal fish runs. We can guess that all of these actions led to natural debris like twigs, leaves, and pebbles being washed into the river. So here's my natural debris going into the river. If we were in a classroom, I would ask students how they think the Nacotchtunk used the river. And some answers we might get: bathing, drinking, cooking water, transportation, food source. There's a very long list, right? Which is a good way to incorporate some sort of historical understanding into it as well. About 400 years ago, European colonists arrived to this place. One of the first Europeans kept a journal of his discoveries. He wrote about the Native American communities, the tributaries of Sweetwater, and seeing so many fish, he and his crew tried to scoop them out with a frying pan. The colonists pushed the Nacotchtunk away from the banks of the Potomac, and many other Nacotchtunk died from diseases the colonists introduced. They established permanent plantations to feed the city's growing population and grew tobacco to sell. Soil washed off plantations and into the river. The European settlers introduced new animals to this land, including livestock. Farmers kept pigs and other animals in their barnyards. As rainwater drained out of the barnyard, it carried some of the manure into a little creek behind the farm. The creek flowed into the river. Yikes. You can imagine a room full of sixth graders seeing that manure flow into the river. They have a great reaction. By 1800, Washington, D.C. had been established as the new nation's capital, and gradually the city grew on the banks of the Potomac. Developers cleared wetlands and forests to build houses and businesses. Rains washed loose soil from construction sites into the river. So much soil entered the river that the city dug out a channel to make the river deeper so ships could reach D.C. By the early 1900s, electric power arrived in the city. Far upstream, a coal mine was dug. Rainwater drained down into the mine shaft and soaked the piles of waste and scraps from mining. This made the rain become acidic, sort of like a strong vinegar. Then the acid water trickled off the banks and back out into the river. To burn the coal and produce the power, an electric power plant was built along the banks. Gases coming out of the smokestack combined with moisture in the air formed acids. The pollution fell back to the earth as acid rain or smog. Upstream, large farms planted crops to feed the city's increasing population. Farmers used fertilizers and pesticides to grow enough food for the city. Some of those crops grew right up against the banks of the river, and fertilizer washed off the land and into the water. Washington, D.C. is now one of the largest metropolitan areas in the country. traffic congestion is a big problem for commuters who drive their cars to and from work. Car exhaust fumes, just like power plant fumes, cause acid rain. If a car is not kept in good repair, it may also leak oil or other fluids, which will be washed off the pavement and into the river with the next rain. As the city grew, more and more people moved to the nearby countryside. These rural houses were not connected to the city sewer system. Wastewater from these houses flowed into septic tanks under the ground. One homeowner did not maintain the septic tank, and poorly treated sewage seeped into the river. Ugh. And how do the residents of the city spend their time? In one neighborhood, gardeners work in their yards. Many of them use weed killers and chemicals to keep their lawns green. The next rain will wash these chemicals into a little creek and then into the river. One parent teaches their child how to change the antifreeze in their truck. They pour out the used antifreeze into the driveway. Animals can lick the sweet-tasting antifreeze and be poisoned. It can also trickle into nearby creek and poison the fish. On nice days, many people head down to the river. Some zoom up and down on motorboats and don't notice that a little engine oil leaks into the water. Families are picnicking nearby in the parks along the riverbanks. Some of these people leave trash on the shore. With the next storm, that trash will wash into the river. Further upstream is a person fishing. The person snags their hook on a log and rather than untangling it, breaks off the nylon fishing line and leaves it behind. All right, so, hello again. The question that we ask, of course, during this story is who polluted the Potomac? So taking a look after seeing that story, who polluted the Potomac here? Everyone, exactly. Everyone polluted this water. And if you go back, who didn't is great. If you go back in the story, you'll notice that nobody meant to. It was always an afterthought. People were going about their business or industries even. A flood flooded out the coal mine, which brought things into the river and pollution into the river. So nobody is purposely polluting. However, it got incredibly polluted very fast, and now everyone has to deal with it. So it's a really good way to explain to students that, yes, our individual actions, even when we don't mean to, add up and affect not just our environment, but ourselves. So moving forward this lesson, there's a couple ways to go. Of course, I see some really fantastic suggestions that I recommend in the chat that I recommend everyone take a look at because that's not part of the lesson, but I would absolutely have my kids animate their own version of this. That sounds fantastic. But in the lesson plan, it asks you to go, or each different character to go back and explain how they could do something differently so that they're not polluting the river. For example, getting the antifreeze, changing the antifreeze in their car. Instead of pouring the antifreeze out on the curb or whatever, they could dispose of it in a better way, making sure that it does not get into the water systems. Commuters, of course, you could bike to work or school, or you could take public transportation to just limit the amount of pollution that you're putting up into the air. So students will sort of have that personal feel on this for each of their characters. Lastly, I love this part, asking your students to clean up this body of water now. There's, of course, easy parts to it. They could have a little slotted spoon to get the trash done. But then it gets a little bit harder. We recommend bringing in things like coffee filters, and sort of any oily stuff can be sucked up with oil booms or pipe cleaners and things like that. So trying to figure out how can we now have this polluted river or lake. How can we fix that? And what they'll notice is that it's much harder to clean than it is to not pollute in the first place, which of course is a great lesson we want to take away. But it's better if our students figure that out for themselves rather than just being told that. This is a hands-on way to do so. All right. There's one more piece that I would like to show you. It's not a full lesson because of time, but I did want to just mention it because it is about food and agriculture, which I know is an important piece of geography education. And then we'll take questions at the end. We should have time for it. I should also mention we do have demo videos of a lot of our lesson plans on our website. So please feel free to check those out after this if there's something you'd like to take another look at. Oh, on the Potomac, everything that I poured in is something you could find in a pantry. Baking soda and vinegar and a lot of soap or food coloring, things like that. So everything is non-toxic. So this last lesson that I'm just going to kind of describe demonstrates the limited amount of farmland available on Earth and the analysis of arable land over time. It's called Earth Apple. I'm actually going to stop sharing screen. It's called Earth Apple because, let me get this gross water out of here. It begins with an apple. And you tell your students that this apple represents our planet, and we're going to divide this among the different types of land that we have on the planet or surface area. First, you take this apple and you divide it into quarters. You take 3 of those 4 pieces, and this represents all of the water on our planet, about 75%. And of course, we're not, well, now we're starting to, but traditionally we're not growing crops on water. So that is set aside as places where we can't really grow crops. Next pieces, you've got the inhospitable land here. And this is land where people can't live and we can't grow food, whether it's too cold, too hot, too dry, too wet, or too rocky for mountain peaks. Then we've got our last pieces. This hard to see. These 4 pieces are the hospitable land, so we can live here, but we don't necessarily grow food everywhere that we can. So these are all areas we could grow food, but choose not to. Whether it's because it's the Amazon rainforest and we've decided to preserve that land because it serves other uses. Or maybe this land is for rangelands, for the meat that we have chosen to eat and make a big part of our diets. So this land is also not used for growing food. We're lastly left with this little tiny piece, which is what we use to grow food on. It's about 3 to 4% of our entire planet's surface. And if we're really talking only the topsoil, that really nutrient-rich good stuff, which is just the peel of that, this peel represents all of the soil that we use to feed our entire population worldwide. So it's a really great lesson to show students what we're working with, or what we think we have to grow all of our food on, and what we actually have to grow all of our food on. A good visualization as well. This is displayed in this graph here. as well as for our secondary students, we have the part of the lesson is considering diets and looking at how many people we could feed if with our current world grain harvest, which is about 2 billion tons. However, each country is different. In the United States, we eat quite a bit of meat. So that grain needs to not just go to us, but we need to feed all of the cattle and whatnot that we're then consuming after that. So we eat, the average person in the United States consumes about 800 kilograms of grain. In Italy, this diet makes it so that it's about 400 kilograms of grain per person. In India, 200 kilograms of grain per person. This means that if everybody in the world ate like someone in the United States, we could feed only 2.3 billion people. And that is, of course, is nowhere near the 8 billion that we need to feed. Italy's a little bit better, but still not only halfway there, 4.5 billion people. And if everybody ate like the average person in India in that diet, we could feed 9.1 billion. So while, yes, we have limits on the amount of farmland that we have, one of the variables is how we eat and what we decide to do in our individual actions. And here's just a graph sort of the arable land versus population over time. Of course, as the population has grown, the amount of land per person has shrunk. All right, let's see, actually, we've got about 5 minutes. I'm gonna ask for questions. So does anybody have any questions that they'd like to share? I wish we had longer, but let me take a look in this Q&A here. Copy of the presentation. Jennifer, that's a great question. I'm not sure if I can get a copy of the slides, but we absolutely have all of the lesson plans. Will be on, you'll have access to all of our online lesson plans. So the lesson plans print out in an easy, actually, I think I can show you through the screen share. So here's what the lesson plan looks like when you're printing it out, easy PDF kind of. And then if we take a look at once you enter your information and receive the online curriculum, here are all of the lesson plans. You can search by grade, by subject, by theme, and then really dig in. They have a description, and you can really take a look at all of the different activities we have available and see what fits for your units and things like that. It looks like that's all I have for questions, which is great because I do have a couple things before we leave to go over, and we are just about out of time. Do we have these in French? We do not have our resources in French. I apologize for that. Yes, I apologize. So here are some of the links, really the only link that you will need for this activity, to get these resources. And this is all available on that spreadsheet with the schedule. But this link here, when you click it, you will be taken to a sort of a website that asks you to input your first name, last name, email, and then you'll select which conference you attended. You'll choose the Geo conference. It asks you a couple more questions, and when you press submit, it will give you that for the Common Good lesson plan, along with every other lesson plan in our online curriculum. There are 60 of them. Oh, internal error. You know, Jennifer, I'll make sure you all get that link. It is, yikes. The link is also in the, and I'll work on this after the session ends and make sure that we get the link back up working for those of you who cannot get in. and that the presenters or the organizers put that in. All right. Well, that's all I have for you. Please check back on that spreadsheet that gives our names, or excuse me, that gives the session times, because that's where the link, I'll repost the link once we make sure that's working for everyone. I apologize in advance for that. Other than that, have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the conference. And it was really great working with you all.